Hello and welcome to Japan Explained. Today we are going to talk about Commodore Perry's second visit to Japan. If you didn't listen to the previous episode about his first visit, I highly recommend you start there. Also today, as in the last week's show, I'm joined by Garrett McCorkle from No Country for History podcast, as he has some really cool insights into the American side of the story. So, if you're ready, let's get started. The last time we left, at the moment Perry's squadron set sail from Japan in July 1853. He promised to return the following spring, and that's almost a year, to reflect on what had happened and to work out a strategy for the second visit. And I think that's partly why the expedition was so successful, because before the first visit, Perry and his team had only read about Japan and its people, but now they had a first-hand experience. So I wanted to ask you, after the first visit, did Perry or his crew's opinion of the Japanese change in any way?
So there was more acceptance, generally, less stigmatization, I guess. But there was still the assumption with it that Japan was a bit of a backward place that needed what America could give to it. There was this assumption that America had all of these amazing manufactured goods that Japan needed, that Japan could give certain goods to America. And as we finished up the last episode, it's becoming pretty clear that Japan is likely going to agree to most, if not all, of America's terms. And so there's this assumption that, okay, you're cool because you're going to do what we say, and we can get with that. Which is a little ironic, right? Or the only way America can get Japan to agree to this is through threat of force, especially because up until this point, Japan was rather comfortable with where they were. And I don't want to feed into the stagnation myth that a lot of Americans are buying into. The West, for some reason, just thought that the East needed these manufactured goods. In a famous letter from King George of England in the late 1700s to China, the Chinese emperor ends up writing back to him and says, "We have no need for your manufactures. Basically, we don't want what you're selling. Leave us alone." But that's obviously changed up until this point, and now America has their own slice of this East Asian pie that a lot of people in the West have these giant eyes over. So at the end of the day, a little more acceptance, a little less stigmatization, as long as it came with the assumption that Japan was subservient to American desires.
And even though no treaty had been signed, just arranging a meeting with Japanese officials and presenting a letter from the president was a big step forward. So I'm sure any reports from the mission were covered by newspapers and talked about. Could you please tell us what people in America thought?
So newspapers had been following it rather closely, but news had to come with Perry's return, right? There was practically no reporting on the day-to-day. It was essentially, okay, Perry's gone. Oh, he's returned. These are the things that have happened. It's a great big step forward for the United States. What you see a lot during this time, though, in newspapers are advertisements for travel books. While Perry's in Japan, there are a lot of newspaper articles that are like, want to learn more about Japan? Here are travel books written by X, Y, and Z, this person who went there a couple years ago, if you want to understand a little bit more about it. You start to see a lot of those. Eventually, Perry decides to write his own. It's quite literally just the report he presents to Congress, and then he just publishes it. But still, I mean, Americans have a big desire to learn about this. And I should say, it is the mostly upper educated Americans that are interested in this, especially because around this time, Japanese style, Japanese goods and decor are what's in fashionably. And so the upper classes especially are very interested.
Meanwhile, rumors were spreading in Japan that the shogunate knew of the foreign ship's arrival, but had been unable to prevent or defend themselves. Since shogun literally means general who defends the barbarians, the people expected the de facto ruler to live up to the title. But just days after Perry's departure, the shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu died, leaving the government in the hands of his son Ieyasu. With Ieyasu unfit to rule, which is a whole other story, almost all domestic and now foreign affairs fell into the hands of chief counselor Abe Masahiro. And Abe chose a very unconventional decision-making strategy. First, he called in experts and organized a vote to bear what the daimyo feudal lords had to say on the subject. Reading all these foreign books didn't do him any good, traditionalist colleagues probably thought. But Abe's actions could also be explained by his reluctance to make a decision. Both theories are easy to believe, for to acknowledge the incapacity to resist Occidental aggression would be to invite the ruin of the Tokugawa house. To resist, on the other hand, would be to invite the destruction of the empire. Who would like to choose between the two? But Abe had to. So first he invited the experts to help the councillors make a decision. One of them was a man called John Manjiro, a fisherman who had been shipwrecked in the Pacific at the age of 14, rescued by an American whaling ship, and later adopted and educated in America until he decided to return to Japan 10 years later. While the young man was prepared to die on his journey home, on arrival in Japan, he discovered that, at least in his home province of Tosa, the strict laws for returnees have been abandoned in favor of practicality. After being formerly imprisoned, Manjiro was soon hired to lecture at school about the world and America in particular. By bringing Manjiro in, Abe hoped to learn more about his new enemy, but also to use the fisherman-turned-criminal-turned-expert's knowledge to ease the fears and temper the zeal of the nationalists eager to fight the black ships. Manjiro over-delivered. While providing a lot of factual information, he couldn't hide his affection for the Americans, turning them into born-to-be gentle, physically perfect and beautiful people who were virtuous and generous and do no evil. While some councillors were convinced, others labeled Manjiro a spy and refused to believe anything he had to say. Some also found it unacceptable that Abe would call a peasant to advise the high-ranking samurai government. But then the chief senior councillor took another unexpected step. For the first time ever, the Tokugawa shogunate made its decision-making a matter of public debate. Abe sent copies of the translation of the president's letter to daimyo, Confucian scholars, high bakufu officials, and even the imperial court. What did they think of the demands? Should the country open up or remain closed? Most of the Confucian scholars urged that the Americans be expelled without making any concessions to them. The emperor's advice was to straighten the coastal defenses. As for the daimyo, asking them was a disaster. Most daimyos didn't have much to say on the matter. Why would they? They were never asked about anything. Out of 61 responses, 19 were for accepting the American offer, 19 were against, and the remaining 23 were too vague to be considered. Yet most daimyos seemed ready to go to war to prevent foreigners from setting foot on the sacred Japanese soil. Worse still, the poll made it clear that the shogun's government simply could not handle the incident on its own, making it look weak. Then there was Tokugawa Nariaki, a powerful head of the Mito clan, one of 3 families that would provide an heir to the shogun if one died childless. Nariaki was Abe's polar opposite. He spoke and wrote about the dangerous Christianity that foreigners would bring to Japan and how war would boost the morale of the samurai. But he also had some valid points. For example, the need to straighten coastal defenses and the fact that Japan would gain nothing by agreeing to the proposals in the president's letter. With public opinion even worse than Abe had expected, while convinced that war with America would be tragic, he was now faced with the question of how to achieve the extremely unpopular opening without bloodshed. About 3 weeks after Perry's departure, a Russian squadron led by the flagship Pallada entered Nagasaki. Unlike Perry, Vice Admiral Putyatin complied with the demand that all intercourse with foreigners be conducted there. He did not run, nor did he show off his guns and cannons by practicing firing them, let alone threatening bombardment. But the very presence of his squadron, coming so soon after the American one, helped to convince the Bakufu that seclusion could not be maintained. Accepting Perry's terms was the only realistic alternative. Perry didn't know that. In his notes, the Russian squadron was his rival, trying to steal America's glory for opening up Japan. He even goes so far as to claim that if Commodore Perry should fail in his peaceful attempts, Russia was on the spot not to mediate, but to tender to Japan her aid and ally in the conflict. On this second visit to China, Perry's eagerness to block any possible venture by a rival fleet went even further, as he'd bought up all the coal he could, and was furious to learn that an American in charge of naval stores had responded to Putin's pleas by lending him 20 tons of that supply, in violation of Commodore's orders. That was the last straw. Already fearing competition from the Russians and French, Perry reconsidered his original plans to come to Japan in late spring. I determined, rather than to allow either the French or the Russians to gain an advantage over me, to encounter all the inconveniences and exposures of cruise to Japan with such a large force in midwinter, regardless of the terrible accounts given by writers of the storms and fogs and other dangers to be met with on this inhospitable coast in the inclement season, he wrote in the report. On a side note, at this point, I'm really starting to hate the guy, as he's way too pushy and way too arrogant. Ignoring the Navy Department's order to leave one of his 3 steamers in China, Perry sailed from Hong Kong to Edo Bay via Naha on 14th January 1854. Just before leaving Naha for Japan, Perry received a letter from the Governor-General of Dutch India, informing him of the death of the Emperor of Japan. Well, actually, the aforementioned Shogun Ieyasu. The letter asked Perry to postpone his second visit. The Japanese government and the Dutch Factoria tried to discourage Perry from coming at all, but the Commodore was determined. The Commodore hoped that the present rulers of Japan would present no obstacles to accomplishing friendly relations between the American nation and the Japanese. Again, his own words. On February 13th, the squadron arrived in Japan. By this time, more and more people in Japan supported Abe's position of peaceful dialogue with foreigners. Even if Japan could build a force to counter Perry's ships, it would take more time and money. Improved coastal defenses, one of the few things everyone in the government considered important, would take at least 5 years to complete. The ships they had ordered from the Dutch and the ones Japan was starting to build itself were not yet ready, and even when they were, they would have no chance against American steamers. Even Tokugawa Nariaki accepted the policy of civil communication with the barbarians. However, he felt that the Bakufu should only be accommodating to Perry while the rest of the country continued to prepare for a possibly inevitable war. The arrival of the enlarged squadron proved Abe right. The American fleet was no match for Japan. To make his appearance even more impressive, Perry had the barely 1-year-old paddle-wheel frigate Powhatan join the steamers Mississippi and Susquehanna, as well as adding a few smaller ships to the squadron.
I think a lot of these ships were present in the Mexican-American War. Perry specifically selected ships and commanders that he commanded during that war for this expedition. And so again, there's that connection between trying to expand the United States and using all of these specific ships, right? There's a clear connotation in their minds when they're using all of this.
Ignoring Japanese guard boats, the ship passed Turaga, entered Edo Bay, and anchored at American Anchorage in the early afternoon. But while the shogunate in Edo prepared for the inevitable, the second visit of the black ships didn't attract much public interest. Rumors of the barbarians returned, and some leaflets claimed that this time Japan would destroy them in one sweep. There was little panic in Edo. People went about their business as usual. Japanese officials and interpreters came aboard the Powhatan, which Perry had made his flagship for the visit. Long, tedious talks about where the Americans should land went on for weeks. Perry, again not in person but through Adams, insisted that he would meet the Japanese negotiators on the shore facing their current anchorage, while Japanese officials were equally adamant that the meeting should be held at Uraga. Threats to move to Edo were, to Perry's disappointment, met with no response from the Japanese. Messengers continued to arrive day after day, asking about the Commodore's health and bringing him vegetables, eggs, and sweets. The following week, Adams even made a round trip to Uraga to exchange letters with senior Japanese officials. And yet, 10 days of negotiations bore no fruit. On the 22nd of February, a 21-gun salute dedicated to Washington's birthday could be heard from afar. Finally, on the 23rd, Kayama Eizaemon appeared, and while the officers were glad to see the man who had played such an important part in their first visit, and relieved to know that he wasn't being punished for being too friendly with them, the offer Kayama brought was the same boring, "Please go to Uraga." They had been fed for almost 2 weeks. To make the Japanese officials think again, Perry lifted anchor and ordered his ships to sail closer to Edo. And it worked. The next day, Kayama returned with a proposal to hold a meeting in the village of Yokohama, just opposite where the ships were currently anchored. After inspecting the coast, Perry seemed pleased with the location and agreed to hold the meeting there, leaving the visit to Edo for later. The treaty house was moved piece by piece from Uraga and set up at the new location. While waiting for the construction to be completed, the Americans threw a few parties for Japanese officials. It all looked civil, but internally, the crew made fun of the Japanese for wearing petticoats and bringing home leftover foods in their nose papers. Wait a bit, and the Japanese will have their turn to laugh when an American sailor mistakes hair oil for liquor. At the same time, the Edo government wasn't in a mood to party. They were arguing over which conditions of the president's letter to accept and which to reject. Perry was frightening. One day, according to a Japanese interpreter, he threatened that in the event of war, he would have 50 ships in nearby waters and another 50 in California. Perry was bluffing. The American Navy didn't even have that many ships at the time, but the Japanese government had no way of checking this, so the statement made them think twice about every move they made during negotiations. On the 8th of March, the treaty house was completed and the ceremonies were to begin at noon. But in the morning, Perry saw that the building was surrounded by linen screens. For some reason, this upset him and he immediately sent an officer to demand that the screens be removed. They were hastily folded off and taken away. At noon, after the colorful procession of Japanese officials, Perry made his grand entrance, starting with a gun salute, drum rolls, music, and a 500-man escort to welcome him ashore. The Japanese loved ceremony, but it seemed he loved it even more. Then, faster than the audience would have wished, both parties entered the treaty house and the negotiations began. First tea and sweets were served, then Perry and 4 of his men were invited into a small room where 5 Bakufu commissioners were waiting for them. A long scroll was handed to Perry. It was addressed to His Majesty the President and stated that while answering all the Americans' requests was positively forbidden by the laws of our imperial ancestors, Japanese government shall entirely comply with the proposal of your government considering coal, wood, water, provisions, and the saving of ships and their crews in distress. To cut a long story short, the Bakufu simply called everything they didn't want to impossible or forbidden and agreed to the bare minimum of requirements that would hopefully be enough to satisfy the Americans and get them to leave. While accepting the answer without argument, Perry's mind was on signing a treaty with Japan, so he gave the commissioners his own note stressing the importance of the treaty and a draft of such a treaty, promising that Japan would benefit greatly from signing it. Of course, he was also lying. And then he completely changed the subject. One of the Marines from the Mississippi had died 2 days before the conference, and Perry asked for permission to bury him on Japanese soil. While Nagasaki was the obvious first answer, he later set the precedent by negotiating the burial in Yokohama itself, and then returned to his ship, satisfied. The next day, the funeral took place, and Yanosuke, the chief interpreter for the Japanese side, announced that the 13th of March had been set as the date for the exchange of gifts. Now, the gift giving and entertainment is my absolute favorite part of the whole story. When the formalities of making lists of gifts and the people to whom they were to be given were over, it was time for a display. The telegraph line was light from the treaty house to the post about a mile away. Crowds gathered to test it and were amazed to see the message travel instantaneously between the stations. The next big hit was a miniature railroad, completed with a train that could travel at around 20 miles per hour. As the report puts it, the train was so small that it could hardly carry a child of 6 years of age. The Japanese, however, were not to be cheated out of a ride, and as they were unable to reduce themselves to the capacity of the inside of the carriage, they betook themselves to the roof. Samurai took turns whirling around, their loose robes blowing in the wind as they clung to the roof. Although not the part of the present display, American clothing was another source of fascination. As all the crew members observed, the Japanese were very curious and eager to learn about anything new. So the foreigners' strange costumes were no less peculiar to the Japanese than their petticoats were to the Americans. The next meeting was scheduled for the 16th of March, but the weather was very bad, so it was postponed for a day. Instead, a letter arrived from the commissioners informing the Commodore of their decision. There was nothing new in the letter, to be honest. The Japanese negotiators relied on stubbornly repeating their lines: wood, coal, water, okay. For all the rest, please go to Nagasaki. Until they were backed into the corner and forced to give more. The meeting took place the next day, and if I were in the Japanese commissioner's shoes, I'd be very angry. But despite Perry's arrogance and constant lying, in fact, even his own chief interpreter Williams was very displeased with Commodore's actions, I also almost understand him losing his temper over the same Nagasaki, Nagasaki, Nagasaki when he was clearly saying anything but. And as much as I don't want to admit it, he was right. Nagasaki was a city with an entire system designed to control foreigners, whose role was to stay put and be happy they were allowed to come in the first place. And I wouldn't want my fellow countrymen to be placed somewhere between spies and zoo animals and treated accordingly. So Perry fought until the port of Shimoda was offered instead, and a few days later officials returned with the answer that another option might be Hakodate. On the 24th of March, it was Japan's turn to offer gifts. As the Commodore and his interpreters entered the treaty house, they saw presents piled on tables, benches, and even the floor. There were scrolls, lacquer boxes and trays, porcelain tea sets, bamboo stands, silk clothes, dolls, jars of soy sauce, swords, umbrellas, and even hundreds of unusual seashells. While the Commodore's official report describes the fine quality of all the items, at the time many Americans were disappointed by the gifts, as they didn't understand their value. But then the Americans were invited outside to see a very special gift from the emperor: 200 bales of rice, each weighing about 60 kilos. Soon everyone's attention was caught by, how Perry describes it, a body of monstrous fellows who tramped down the beach like so many huge elephants. They were professional wrestlers and formed a part of the retinue of the princes who kept them for their private amusement and for public entertainment. They were some 25 in number and were men enormously tall in stature and immense in weight of flesh. Their scant costume, which was merely a coloured cloth about the loins, adorned with fringes and emblazoned with the armorial bearings of the prince to whom each belonged, revealed their gigantic proportions in all the bloated fullness of fat and breadth of muscle. A wrestler called Koyanagi was presented to Perry by the commissioners, who urged the Commodore to feel the champion's muscles. He grasped Koyanagi's huge arm, then felt his neck, which he noticed was wrinkled like that of a prize ox. The officers also examined the wrestler, and when they uttered exclamations of disbelief, he responded with an appreciative grunt. At a given signal, each wrestler lifted 2 bales of rice and carried them with ease closer to American boats. One even held a sack with his teeth. The sailors then huffed and puffed, lifting the bales into their boats and unloading them. But then it was time for the sumo wrestling matches, and from that moment on, the description gets worse and worse. And it made me wonder, the Americans were clearly amused, but in their letters and reports they sound rather bitter. Sumo wrestlers, for example, are hardly human to them. Even in the published official report, they are mostly referred to as monsters, beasts, and animals. Was this a way of justifying their entry into Japan and showing that they were the saviors of the remote nation? Or did they really believe in what they were writing?
In college, I had a professor who would always say both things can be true. And I think that's really the case here. These type of wrestling matches took place with enslaved black wrestlers. Not exactly sumo wrestling matches, but wrestling matches nonetheless. And it is sort of portrayed as like a barbaric, primitive pastime. Western views of stagnation is a theme I keep going back to because that's really how the West would have viewed, and certainly Americans. Around this time, the idea of the white man's burden is being formed. And the main idea around this is that it's the goal of the white man to go across the world and spread ideas of civilization, spread ideas of Christianity. And overwhelmingly, these ideas of civilization are Western European, American standards of what civilization is. That's certainly playing into it here. America genuinely does think that they are sort of saving the Japanese from themselves. And from what I gather about this exchange is that the Japanese put on a sumo wrestling match, then the Americans put on a minstrel show for them. And this minstrel show would have had a lot of stereotypes about various groups of people in America. Most prominently, Black Americans. There likely would have been an American sailor who would have put on blackface, like painted themselves entirely black and portrayed themselves as a Black person. Usually in very negative ways too, as a sort of backwards type of human that is through their nature dumb. They also would have done this with an Irish type of character. Irish immigration around this time is really becoming prominent in the United States, and they weren't excluded from these stereotypes. You know, typical stereotypes we still see associated with Irish people today. Heavy drinker, all that type of stuff, loves to fight. And they would have seen like Native American descriptions or stereotypes. So it's really interesting that they're doing all of this, right? Trying to show them like what life in America is. And overwhelmingly, it's saying that non-white people are rather dumb. It makes me wonder what the Japanese people think about this. The whole time, are they sitting there thinking, okay, do they think we're stupid too?
I'm not sure what they thought about the show, but they were not impressed by table manners of the Americans. They were too loud and they couldn't hold chopsticks.
Oh, really? And unfortunately, too loud is something when I've traveled that I hear quite a bit is associated with Americans still. But it doesn't really surprise me, right? And it kind of goes back to the way that the Japanese artists depict Perry and the other Americans. That they're big, they're boisterous, they're loud. The black ships totally fit into that narrative too, right? There's these giant black ships, puff out smoke, have all these giant guns. I mean, it's really fascinating to see how these cultures are sort of stereotyping one another.
Back to this point, actually, after the sumo match, it was time for the Americans to show their gifts to the Japanese commissioners. Again, quoting the report, It was a happy contrast which a higher civilization presented to a disgusting display on part of the Japanese officials. They presented the telegraph and the railway again, and then put on a military show which the commissioners seemed to enjoy. 3 days later, on 27th of March, a banquet was held on the Powhatan to repay the hospitality received on shore. By this time, both parties were well acquainted with each other's customs and etiquette, so the tour of the ship, the meal, carefully prepared by Perry's French chef, and the entertainment all went smoothly and in a truly friendly manner. By the end of the day, the Japanese were so drunk and cheerful that one of the commissioners even hugged the Commodore, so hard, the report says, that Perry's new epaulets were absolutely crushed. After a few more days of negotiations, the treaty, later known as the Treaty of Kanagawa, was finally signed on the 31st of March. It provided for peace and friendship between the United States of America and the Empire of Japan, the opening of 2 ports, Shimoda and Hakodate, for American ships to purchase coal, water, and other necessities, assistance and protection to shipwrecked persons from American ships, assurance that shipwrecked men and other US citizens would not be confined and could move about freely. Both parties seemed satisfied with the outcome. Perry opened Japan to American ships and even pushed for the possibility of a consulate in Shimoda, while the Japanese commissioners saved Edo from foreigners by offering food and shelter to shipwrecked Americans in 2 small ports far from major cities. Well, anything was better than warships near the capital and the possibility of war. On the 4th of April, the Saratoga left the squadron to deliver the news of the treaty to the US. As for Perry, he now planned to visit the ports that had been opened to the Americans. Now it was finally time for Perry and his crew to interact not only with Japanese officials, but also with ordinary people. At first, they seemed very pleased with their encounters. The Japanese villages were clean and well kept. Everyone was polite, though the bowing felt excessive. Finally, they met some women and children who, the Americans were relieved to know, were a respectable part of society and not nearly the objects as they were in some other Asian nations. But then they witnessed the biggest cultural shock of their trip to Japan. Public bathhouses. Men, women and children all bathing together, all naked, all happily rubbing each other's backs. To Americans, it looked appalling.
I can totally imagine that because you have these very Victorian ideas of what gender is and how the body is supposed to be portrayed. It's very supposed to be hidden. So I totally could see Americans showing up and witnessing this and just being absolutely appalled. That's really interesting. I didn't know they witnessed one of those bathhouses.
It was also during the second visit and the voyages that followed the treaty that artists, as well as ordinary people, made numerous sketches of the foreigners. As a result, we have many illustrations of the behavior and misbehavior of sailors. Pictures of tall, red-haired foreigners, their clothes and tools were a big hit in Japan. They were no longer Tengu-like creatures in court dress, but real people with distinctive features. However, there was some confusion when it came to printing the portraits. The old expression for foreigners was Komo Hekigan, which means red hair, blue eyes. And because printing was not done by the artists themselves, but by separate craftsmen, some printers publish portraits of Perry in which the whites of his eyes are blue instead of the pupils. While the Americans were sketching a lot too, they also brought cameras. Magic mirrors, as locals called them, were rumored to slowly kill anyone whose image was captured by the machine. But, superstitions aside, this means that the first photographs of Japan soon reached America. Did they actually reach America? Did they reach newspapers? Were people eager to see them?
By Perry's expedition, photo technology is still rather primitive. I mean, the camera and photographs have been around for about 20-ish years at this point, but it's still very early. By this time, I mean, presidents have been photographed. The first president that was photographed is John Quincy Adams, who was the sixth president in the 1840s, but it's still rather primitive. But many in America, especially those that consider themselves more educated and enlightened, tend to view the camera rather positively. Like you can't dispute it, right? It's right there in front of you. But photographs were nearly impossible to print in newspapers, which is how most Americans would have read and found out about all of this. It could be done, it was very expensive, and a lot of newspapers didn't have the funds to do that. So, unfortunately, many Americans missed an opportunity to see this, and it was mostly reserved for, from what I can gather, like official dispatches, things like that. However, like I said earlier, those travel journals are becoming really popular. Few of them don't have photographs exactly, but they have sketches made by these people that are in pretty good detail, give an exact glimpse of what Japanese life was like. But most Americans, if they could have gotten their hands on a bunch of these photographs, they would have loved it.
Perry spent a few more months in Japan exploring Shimoda and Hakodate before finally returning home. News of the treaty broke in the US while the Commodore was still on his way back in July of 1854. Now, how was the news of the treaty with Japan received in America?
Americans rejoiced. It reaffirmed a lot of the assumptions that they already had about the world. Most importantly, that America specifically had some sort of destiny. Later, this is going to be called manifest destiny, specifically when talking about expanding westward. That America sort of had this goal, this obligation to spread itself around the world. And it also came with the assumption of the supremacy of white people. But even if you just were to look at the actual details of the treaty, it's very in favor of the United States. America gains a lot from that just politically, because like I said, it really cements them as a world power now, right? Like they're on par with France, with Britain, and that's kind of who they're trying to emulate this whole time.
Has it changed the general image of Japan there?
It's interesting because you mentioned earlier there were some Japanese people.
John Manjiro?
Yes, who had experienced American culture and who was, willing to say that it's superior in some way. After this and more Americans come in, you see a lot more Western influence in Japan. And so there's sort of this idea that the Japanese people are adopting, quote unquote, the correct ways of living, of being. And so views of Japanese people, they get better. It's less of like, oh, it's a stagnant, backwards country, and more of, okay, it's coming into the fold of correct civilization.
Perry's visits and the signing of the treaty allowing foreigners to travel freely in Japan caused great political and social turmoil. The shogunate showed that it had nothing to oppose to foreign powers, and the anti-foreign movement was on the rise, encouraged in some extent by the emperor himself, who felt that he could no longer be stopped from speaking his mind. The same freedom was felt by the daimyo. At the same time, foreigners were showing Japan that it was just a tiny part of a big wide world full of new inventions. Over the next 15 years, Japan would go through a crisis known as Bakumatsu, the end of Bakufu, and would rethink and rebuild itself. But that is another story, one that began with 4 black ships that decided to break the rules, and on a cloudy July day in 1853, arrived in the port of Uraga instead of Nagasaki. Thank you for listening to this episode of Japan Explained, and thank you, Garrett, for joining me today. Please remember that you can always find me on Instagram, Patreon, and japanexplained.com. And if you want to learn more about little episodes that made American history, just like Kurofune changed the course of events in Japan, check out Garrett's No Country for History podcast, because it's just what you need. Talk to you next time. Bye.
Warning, the following ZipRecruiter radio spot you are about to hear is going to be filled with F-words.
When you're hiring, we at ZipRecruiter know you can feel frustrated, forlorn even, Like your efforts are futile, and you can spend a fortune trying to find fabulous people, only to get flooded with candidates who are just fine. Fortunately, ZipRecruiter figured out how to fix all that. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/zip. With ZipRecruiter, you can forget your frustrations because we find the right people for your roles fast, which is our absolute favorite F word. In fact, 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day.
Fantastic.
So, whether you need to hire 4, 40, or 400 people, get ready to meet first-rate talent. Just go to ZipRecruiter.com/zip to try ZipRecruiter for free. Don't forget, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip. Finally, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip.